Right. Hello. This is the week 4 overview video. Um, in this week, you are going to be working on arguments of fact, and, and next week you'll be working on arguments of definition. But the arguments of fact are just going to zero in on what you've been working on last week with and the week before, the structures of argument, and then the way you are forming the types of argument that you have, whether it be the oration or the Rogerian invitational and the Tolman models. So we'll look at Moodle and just get into the assignments. Let me share my screen here. So I won't talk about the image here until the second part. You see, you'll be reading chapter 8, arguments of fact. I think in the syllabus it talks about reading the 2 sections of the chapter. I don't know. What you really need to do there, go through all of the sections of the chapter, and I want you to focus on. There's a part of the text. Oh, I have to share this with you too. You share and look at this in the chapter when it talks about deciding which evidence to use. They describe that they blur the distinction between factual arguments for scientific and technical audiences as those for the general public in magazines, blogs, social media sites. It's significant to pay attention to how that happens before they get to this section, because later on, when you are reading about designing or constructing your own arguments of fact, it's unclear how that distinction is made, because they're assuming that you've already read the chapter and that you see the distinction from the previous information up until the examples that are given. So when you read the examples at the end of the chapter, and they're talking about, so I'm going to ask you to read these examples, and they start to describe the ways in which these arguments are constructed. So they're giving the annotations, talking about the types of factual evidence that are used, and then furthermore, the ethos that's used, so what type of credibility is constructed by the authors in the examples. It would be sort of confusing why they're coming to those conclusions if you hadn't read the previous sections. So the identifying an issue, researching your hypothesis, and refining your claim, those 3 sections up before how the deciding which evidence to use, because those 3 sections start to describe how the distinctions are made between the different types of factual evidence. So factual evidence for science versus factual evidence for a general public. And so you're going to have to think about, for your fuse, what distinctions you'll be bringing to bear. Generally, that when the fuse is discussed, more of the factual arguments for scientific and technical audiences are preferred. But the idea here is that some of what you're going to be using may play more into the general public audience. And so you'll be walking the line between that science, technical, and the general audience. So please pay attention to how this chapter makes those distinctions in the first 3 sections, and then how that plays into the following 2 sections of, 3 sections of deciding what evidence, presenting your evidence, and then considering design. And so really pay close attention to that. If we get back to the Moodle, so you're going to be reading the chapter, and then for Forum 1, you're going to be posting a summary of the chapter, what you understand, or what you think the chapter wants you to understand about arguments of fact. So just a short summary of that. And then post an example of an argument of fact from one or more of your sources, probably just one, but you can do more. And then you're going to be using the portion of the text developing a factual argument to do that, and then giving feedback to a classmate. The portion that you'll be using from the chapter, if we go back to the chapter there, is down where it says Guide to Writing an Argument of Fact. And you should really focus on entering the argument of fact. That's going to help you identify them in your sources. So an argument of fact can take these 4 forms, and then it moves into the rest. So then it talks about how you go researching and then formulating a hypothesis. You don't need to get too deep into the researching, but what you need to focus on, well, how does the source formulate a hypothesis when it does one of the 4 things above? So what hypothesis is formulated, and then the idea here is then you don't have to worry about preparing the proposal, anything that comes back to sort of the Tolman model. And then it goes into considering like genre and media, but more than anything, look at the thinking about organization. This portion of the guide really helps you consider the audience, and that's what you need to be looking at when you're analyzing your source and when you're thinking about your own arguments, is how does the organization connect your argument to your audience, right? And so all of this is going to be significant when you're doing your post, but also when you're thinking about the application to your own writing. And I'll refer back to these pages probably several times through until the end of the term, because it's a really helpful guide to constructing an argument of fact. And then at the end, another helpful part that I already pointed out is the 2 examples that are annotated that describe. So if you want to do it this way, that's fine. You can follow it. I don't expect you to annotate your source to this extent. Like, you don't need to give me your source and then annotate. But if you want, what I'm expecting you to do is to paraphrase. So if there is an annotation, then use that annotation to paraphrase how it connects to the source that you're using. So you can start to annotate your source this way, and then use your own annotation to make your post to actually construct it. And on top of the post, if you look at Moodle again, we'll go back to week 4. So you're going to be posting in week 4, form 1, this, and then also in week 4, assignment 1, you're just going to post the example. So that the example is going to me, the rest is you're going to give an example to your classmates as well, so that they can see the example you provided, and they can see that maybe if they're struggling or they don't feel confident in how to identify arguments of fact, it'd be helpful to see how other people are identifying arguments of fact. And I posted the 4 ways that are in the guide there that are presented to how arguments of fact are initiated. And so again, pay close attention to those examples, because those will help you locate arguments of fact in your sources and in your own arguments. And the reason we're focusing on arguments of fact is that you are most likely going to present arguments of fact in your fuse. And whether or not you think this is obvious, it's really just a way to reflect on a different level of how do we recognize when specific types of arguments arise, and what are the purposes of those arguments, and how do they fit into the audiences that we're expecting to persuade by constructing an argument. So that is just the first portion of the week. The second portion is going to be reading chapter 5 of The Sorcerer's Tale, The Preacher. And this is the final chapter of the text, so you'll be finally finished with The Sorcerer's Tale. I gave you a copy of The Preacher that also has the conclusion and the appendix. You do not have to read the conclusion or the appendix. The only reason I put them there was so that in case you had time and wanted to look at it a little more deeply, was to get sort of the author's perception of why this tale was constructed, which is pretty interesting if you haven't read it already. And then the appendix gives the will, if you look at this. So it gives Gregory Wisdom's will, and that opens up some of the places of the arguments of fact to the types of evidence that are used. And I'll speak to the significance of that when I do the summary videos for next week. But if you look at it, you might understand a little bit more where Ryrie was coming from when he was putting together this story and presenting it as an argument of fact in itself, when most of the time it seems sort of like a true crime pulp novel. The appendix kind of demonstrates sort of why he plays it out that way and what that means when he's thinking about the audience and how his audience will respond to the evidence that he's collected. So that's the reading, is chapter 5. And in the reading, I want you to zero in on the last paragraph of chapter 5. I reproduced it in the assignment itself, but the last paragraph is striking. I never expected the book to end with that paragraph or with this conclusion. And so when you are writing and responding in Forum 2, again, here is the paragraph in its entirety in the forum post, in the assignment post. And then I ask you just to say, well, how does this chapter and your knowledge of the rest of the story support this conclusion? So we're zeroing on this conclusion. Why do you think Ryrie can make this conclusion? Do you think it's a fair conclusion based on what we know about the rest of the book? And then second, do you think just this conclusion ties the Sorcerer's Tale to the other things that we've read this term? Is there any sort of connection that you can make at all between what Ryrie's trying to say here and what Okafor says or Hairston says, or what Alderman says or Federici says in the text that you've read this term? So try to see if there's any connections. If you don't think there are any connections, say that it looks as though Ryrie is speaking from a completely different place and doesn't make any clear connections, or you can't see any clear connections between this conclusion and what you think Okafor or Hairston or Federici or Alderman are doing in their own texts. So that is the second post for the week. And other than that, the rest of the week is only focused on those things. I said that I would mention the image here. When you go to post about the Ryrie text, the Sorcerer's Tale, you might consider the image that I put up here at the top of week 4, because it presents the idea of what modernity was doing to the entire European worldview. So it's narrow, and it's something that Okafor and Hairston and Alderman and Federici are writing against, but it's still something that you might consider that they are writing toward, and to some extent, there's a visual metaphor that can't be denied between what you're seeing in this image and what we've read before. So think about how that image is speaking to the text, the Ryrie, the last paragraph of the Ryrie text, and to the other text that we've read this term. So that's it, and I'll see you again for the summary videos. Thank you.